Welcome to this explainer. For centuries, the absolute ultimate prize in global dominance was literally just land. The bigger your continental empire, the more power you held. But as we push deeper into the 21st century, that whole paradigm has completely flipped. The real theater of power, prosperity, and honestly survival isn't paved with earth and rail anymore. It's water. Specifically, the vast, dynamic, and heavily contested waters of the Indo-Pacific. So let's dive right in and see exactly how geography is actively rewiring the future of global power.
All right, here's our intelligence briefing for today. We're going to cover 1. The geography of global power, 2. India's Great Maritime Awakening, 3. The modern strategic chessboard, 4. India's maritime arc strategy, 5. A whole-of-nation approach, and finally, 6. The future balance of power.
Kicking things off with Section 1, the geography of global power.
To really get what's happening today, we got to look at geopolitics. It's a concept coined back in the 20th century by a Swedish political scientist named Rudolf Kellen. It's basically a way of analyzing international power through maps and physical location, because geography absolutely dictates a nation's foreign policy. Now, historically, there was this massive battle of ideas here. On one side, you had Halford Mackinder's Heartland theory. He argued that global power lived in Central Eurasia. It was all about railways, land power, and continental logistics. And hey, back then, that made perfect sense. But pushing back completely was U.S. political scientist Nicholas J. Spykman with his Rimland theory. Spykman argued, no, it's actually the coastal Rimland, the marine expanses bordering Eurasia, that would call the shots. He basically predicted that the edges of the map, not the landlocked center, would control the future.
And you know what? Spykman hit the nail right on the head. His ideas lined up perfectly with another strategic giant, A.T. Mahan, and his sea power theory. Mahan was convinced that commanding the sea is the absolute baseline for national prosperity, commerce, and great power status. Back in the early 1900s, people still thought massive continental armies were the end-all be-all. But post-1945, globalization just absolutely exploded, and the maritime domain became the undisputed engine of global trade. Suddenly, coastal nations had this massive advantage, and having real sea power became absolutely crucial for securing trade routes and projecting global influence.
Moving right along to Section 2, India's Great Maritime Awakening.
So historically speaking, India always had a very land-centric mindset. For centuries, the ocean was really just seen as a passive highway for trade, a place where foreign merchants showed up, rather than a strategic frontier you had to actually defend. But check out this massive statistic. Today, a staggering 95% of India's trade by volume and 70% by value moves straight through the seas. That is huge. India sits right at the head of the Indian Ocean component of the Indo-Pacific, meaning its prosperity, its energy security, and its long-term global influence literally sink or swim based on these exact waters.
But it's not like this realization just happened overnight. If we look way back to the 1650s and 60s, Shivaji Maharaj originally had that same traditional mindset, that the sea was just a market gateway. But then, as our source material notes, reality hit him like a bolt. He suddenly realized the ocean was actually this massive, completely exposed, strategic vulnerability. So what did he do? He rapidly weaponized his shores and built up his naval arm. It was really one of India's very first oceanic awakenings.
All right, Section 3, the modern strategic chessboard.
Today, the Indo-Pacific is so much more than just a spot on a map. It's this massive geopolitical construct, housing the world's biggest economies and manufacturing hubs. And since modern global politics is heavily governed by economics, these waters are absolute ground zero for intense strategic competition. Just think about 3 critical choke points: Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, and Malacca. The sheer volume and value of global trade squeezing through these tiny, narrow corridors is mind-blowing. They are the literal arteries of the world economy. That's exactly why distant powers like Australia and Japan, right alongside South Asian nations, have such a massive stake in monitoring and ideally controlling these tight bottlenecks.
Which naturally brings us to the strategic moves of other major players. Take China, for example. They've been aggressively seeking alternative supply routes to avoid what strategists call the Malacca dilemma. Basically, the very real fear that their vital shipping lanes could just get blockaded at the Malacca Strait during a conflict. To get around that vulnerability, they heavily developed port facilities in Myanmar and pushed the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC. Now, according to the source, this does 2 things. It efficiently secures their supply chains while simultaneously spinning a security ring right around India to monitor its seaboards.
Which takes us to Section 4, India's maritime arc strategy.
Faced with this geopolitical reality,
India obviously can't just sit on the sidelines. They have to play the game, right? They need a comprehensive strategy to engage the Rimland, stay flexible, and secure their own backyard while expanding eastward. This entire response is captured in the evolution from Sagar to Mahasagar. These are India's primary maritime strategies, designed to establish the nation as a major, proactive diplomatic and naval player in the Indian Ocean. But we aren't just talking about friendly diplomatic handshakes here. It requires real hard capabilities, strengthening sea power, cranking up indigenous naval production, and vastly upgrading logistics across the entire region.
And this right here is where geography and military strategy beautifully intersect. Our source describes the development of the Sabang port in Indonesia as a total strategic masterstroke. Its positioning is just incredible, sitting right at the mouth of the Malacca Strait. And get this, it is only 160 kilometers away from the southern tip of India's Andaman and Nicobar island chain. Just 160 kilometers. By extending its reach from those island outposts all the way to Sabang, India is projecting some serious maritime power right over one of the most critical choke points on the planet.
But military posturing is only half the puzzle. Let's look at the ASEAN Connect. ASEAN nations are basically the linchpin of the Indo-Pacific architecture. Now, India strategically opted out of the massive Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, largely because of trade deficit concerns and the overarching Chinese economic influence in that pact. Instead, India did something really smart. They engaged ASEAN countries one-on-one with individual free trade agreements. It's a meticulous approach that protects Indian industries while also building deep defense diplomacy, digital footprints, and tech partnerships. It projects India as a highly reliable partner without locking them into a restrictive economic group.
Section 5. A whole-of-nation approach. To truly lock down its interests in the Indo-Pacific, India knows that just building massive ships and naval bases isn't going to cut it. The strategy has to go way beyond the military domain. Sure, on one side, you absolutely need that military focus on naval capacity and deep-water logistics to strictly protect your interests, no doubt about it. But on the other side, you've got this deeply interwoven economic and diplomatic mission. We're talking trade, cutting-edge tech, energy, and serious soft power, all while aggressively leveraging private sector participation. It's a true whole-of-nation approach. For India's long-term vision to succeed, all these instruments of power have to coordinate perfectly to integrate deeply into the region's economic fabric.
And finally, Section 6, the future balance of power.
The setup of the 21st century Indo-Pacific is frankly incredibly complex. It's an absolute game changer for global dynamics, and India's right in the middle of it. What we're seeing forming right now is this vibrant cauldron of quasi-multilateral groupings. We're talking nations with fundamentally different alignments coming together over critical shared interests. You've got the Quad, AUKUS, ASEAN, and the Indian Ocean Rim Association, or IORA. For India, the absolute imperative here is maintaining strategic autonomy within this intricate web. They have to practice multi-alignment, building strong, long-lasting relationships based on a shared regional vision, without getting chained to rigid, old-school military alliances that would just limit their strategic flexibility.
And that brings us to the core philosophy driving this entire theater. There's a quote directly from our source material that I absolutely have to share, because it just perfectly distills the real objective here. It says, Indo-Pacific strategy is not restricted to contain Chinese presence, but to preserve the neutrality of the global maritime lifeline. Ultimately, it's about a stable balance of power. It's about aggressively preventing any single expanding nation from taking over, and ensuring we have a predictable, rules-based regime where global trade can flow freely and securely for everyone.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought to chew on. The era of sprawling continental land empires, that's definitively over. The oceans are what will dictate our collective global future. But in these congested, highly contested waters of the Indo-Pacific, ultimate influence isn't just going to go to whoever floats the biggest fleet of heavily armed warships. The real, lasting power, that's going to belong to the nation that can build the widest, most resilient network of trust, capability, and shared purpose. The strategic chessboard is officially set. The only question now is, how will the players move next?